2017 Nebraska Beef Cattle Report features University of Nebraska-Lincoln research on subjects such as cow-calf management, using residues in forages, and growing and finishing animals. One of the topics in this year's report focuses on predicting performance in the feedlot. Jim MacDonald, a UNL associate professor in the Department of Animal Science, is part of the group looking at that issue. He joined us Wednesday in the R.B. Warren Arena to explain how predicting performance can be beneficial.
The principle of marketing cattle is to be able to continue to put weight on until the cost of putting on that additional pound of weight exceeds the price that you receive for it. Now, that doesn't always hold true in terms of market dynamics, and we're in that situation right now. But in general, knowing what your cost of gain is very important to targeting a specific marketing date. Now, everybody knows the cost of gain retrospectively because they look at their closeouts, right? But that's on average. And so what's much more difficult to predict is a cost of gain on a daily incremental basis. So what's happening to feed efficiency and cost of gain every day that they're in the feed yard.
You've done some research on this topic. Lay out the study for me.
So we've done a couple of things over the last few years. One of them was a modeling type experiment where we weighed cattle every 2 weeks. We've got a pretty good handle on how dressing percent changes, and so we're able to predict carcass weight as cattle would be marketed every 2 weeks, and then run some regression lines through them. So we were able to evaluate what's happening if you market cattle on a live basis and what happens if you marketed them on a carcass weight basis. And I think most of the industry recognizes commonly held belief that feed efficiency is declining as cattle are on feed. So composition of gain changes. You're putting down less muscle, you're putting down more fat. That's why dressing percent increases with time on feed. That's pretty well understood, and largely understood that feed efficiency is declining with the feeding period. Okay, but that changes in the carcass. That's not as true if you're looking at feed efficiency on a carcass basis. So feed efficiency is much flatter throughout the feeding period if you're looking at cost of gain for the carcass compared to cost of gain in the live animal. And the reason that changes is because dressing percent is going up, and at the end of the feeding period, 90 to 95% of every pound that is added to the animal goes directly onto the carcass.
There's been a lot of focus on the size of animals coming into the feedlot. You looked at the weights of those animals coming in and their efficiency after. What did it show?
In general, a lighter animal is going to be more efficient. You start with a lighter animal, they're going to be more efficient throughout the feeding period because you're putting on a higher proportion of muscle compared to the proportion of fat. A larger animal that's been backgrounded in gone through a yearling system, either in a pen or out on grass, they've already laid down a large proportion of their muscle, and so proportionately they're putting down more fat. They're going to be less efficient throughout the feeding period. However, the change, surprisingly, is very similar for the yearling and the calf fed. And what I mean by that is a calf fed might be on feed for 180 to 200 days. A yearling may be on feed for 100 to 120 days. If you change the axis and look at it as a percent of time on feed rather than and as days on feed, because you can't really compare those two, right? Surprisingly, it was surprising to me at least, that dressing percent change is very similar in that larger yearling animal compared to the calf-fed animal. So I think the principle applies that reduction in feed efficiency in the live animal is true, but then when you look at marketing on a carcass basis, doesn't necessarily hold true anymore.
You shouldn't necessarily shy away from those big animals then?
We shouldn't necessarily shy away from feeding cattle longer if it's profitable, and that's certainly been the trend, right? And especially, we're in a much better situation today than we have been previously in terms of profitability in the feed yard. But it's really important during times when profitability is negative, when you're losing money, people tend to want to pull the trigger quickly. And that may in fact be the wrong decision if they're marketing in the carcass. If they're marketing live, that intuition is probably correct. But if they're marketing in the carcass, they may actually be losing more money by selling them early. Pretty difficult for me today to make an argument with somebody who's wants to sell early with the positive basis that we've had and increasing markets on both the futures market and the actual price that they're receiving. So that doesn't really hold true in today's segment, but there's a lot of discussion about wanting to reduce carcass weights, and that's a good thing for the industry. May not necessarily be a good thing for an individual producer, depending on their specific scenario.